Thank you everyone for joining. These sessions at 2:30 as part of the National Board Academy have just been sponsored by the National Board Network of NAME. So we love having everyone on. Just want to say welcome, good afternoon. If you are back and you participated last week, welcome back. If you're new to this session, you will learn so much during this time. So we appreciate you being here. Can't wait to get it started. So I'm going to turn it right over to Juliana right now to introduce our guest for today.
Hello, everybody. It is so wonderful to be here with you. I am enjoying watching the chat and seeing that we have people from all over the country. So thanks again for being here. My name is Juliana Ortube. I am an educator in Las Vegas, Nevada. I am a National Board Fellow. And it's my pleasure to be here to introduce Olmeca on behalf of NAME. NAME is an organization that is working to parallel the work between National Board and elevating teachers of color in order to make sure that all of our students have accomplished educators. Today's session is really about bridging and centering how we bring in cultural identities and how we bring in social justice work into the classroom. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce Olmeca. He is a bilingual hip-hop artist, producer, activist, and scholar who's been featured on Complex Magazine, Billboard, NPR, Huffington Post, Noisy, and my favorite, Democracy Now! His work is also featured in various documentaries on PBS, BBC, and also, if you might have heard, Sons of Anarchy. Along with his work on immigration identity, Black and Brown unity, Olmeca is a sought-after speaker because of his ability to intersect art, politics, culture, and identity. He tours college campuses across the entire country, doing residencies and keynotes and lectures. He's been noted by social justice dignitaries like Dolores Huerta, Luis Rodriguez, Noemi Klein, and many others. Olmeca is currently a Kennedy Center Citizen Artist Fellow, and he's a faculty here at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, working in the interdisciplinary Gender and Ethnic Studies Department. He teaches Latin American history, Latinx in the US, and hip hop and social justice courses. So Olmeca, welcome, thank you for being here. We are excited to learn from you, so I'm turning it over.
Well, thank you everybody for being here. Can you hear me? Is everything sound good? All right, cool. So yes, so first of all, yeah, muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much for being here. I don't wanna prolong this too much. I wanna make sure that we have enough time for questions and answers or possible answers, maybe suggestions. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing that I think about when we talk about education is about changing the world, right? So teachers, professionals are all part of an ongoing process to help create change. We're not the chosen ones, we're not the ones, we're not the lone saviors, but we are part of a long legacy of great people and communities who have fought hard to get us where we are today. But having said that, as we know, until all students, all people have just their basic needs met, there's still work to do. And I do feel that if you're here and you want to hear about these things, it's because this is what we want, right? This is what we want to try to do, right? Create change in one way or another. And one of the ways in which we do that as educators is through our students. So, let's see. So the first thing I wanted to say is that the second thing is that in addition to the trials and tribulations that youngsters may have in their lives as teenagers, as kids, you know, just the everyday struggles that they go through. I believe that students who are marginalized, students of color especially, have additional burdens of walking in a world that does not fully understand who they are or what gifts they have to offer. Sometimes it's because they're drowning. They want to scream on the top of their lungs. They act up in class, and you might see it just as that, you know, like, what's going on with this kid? You know, they're just acting up. we don't fully understand why and the motivation behind that from the students. Sometimes it's because of these burdens that they carry alongside just being youngsters, right? But just things that happen at home, whether it's being bilingual and having to translate for the parents or whatnot, and then having to carry that work on top of the work that they have as kids. Other times they just simply act up, like, you know, like some of us, like me, I used to act up a lot in class. So we have to get to a point where we can give students the opportunity basically to display their excellence, right? We have to give them the benefit of the doubt. We have to just give them a space so that we can see just how beautiful they are. And so how do we do that? So what I wanted to do is I wanted to share a story from this amazing teacher that I had, my English teacher, Miss Perry. Now the picture on the right, you see it, those are young women in high school that were part of these things they call party crews in Los Angeles. So in the 90s, that's all we all thought about. It's just partying and acting up. And I myself was a knucklehead kid. I am the stereotypical kid that grows up in the hood, Mexican American, involved, entrenched in violence from gangs, in poverty, always moving around, always migrating from place to place because we couldn't pay our rent. So that's from the perspective that I'm talking about, okay? So I wanted to share the story about Miss Perry because I feel like that's the best way for us to understand what's going on, right? So Miss Perry was my English teacher. I was on a good one, always acting up in class, disrupting and getting others to do the same. I had a gift for that, for sure. One day while I was standing by the printer, Miss Perry asked me, "What are you doing here, sir? What work do you have for me to see?" I said, "None." She then asked if she could see what I was printing. Seeing pages and pages and pages being printed with words sparked her curiosity. Mind you, she didn't immediately ask me to sit down. She didn't give me an order. She didn't accuse me, especially given that we had no assignments for us to print out. So I was essentially struck by the fact that she didn't give me an order and she didn't get me in trouble right away. So I had no choice. I was caught there and there was nothing that I can do about it. I didn't lie because I felt I owed her that for not making me feel like a criminal. I did get in trouble. I was assigned extra work and my book was taken away before the end of class. The following day though, Ms. Perry came in with the book entitled A Book of Quotations. She said, moving forward, I was to select 5 poems in each class, write my thoughts about them, and if I was compelled, I was to write my own poetry. So I think what Ms. Perry saw was that I was printing lyrics. In her view, I was not learning a subject, but rather I was implementing the lessons that come from it. Simply, more reading and more writings make for a better rapper. So what I learned from Ms. Perry was essentially never walk in front of your students, never walk behind your students, but always try to walk with your students. And we'll get into that a little bit more. Okay, so now I want to take a little pause because I want this to be as interactive as possible. And if you can help me by answering this, have you been a Ms. Perry to any of your students? And we'll give you a couple of minutes to answer that question. You can answer that with a simple yes, no, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm always a Miss Perry. Okay. All right, so we're gonna move forward. Now let's get into this beautiful thing called theory. What we did right now was essentially what I like to do, which is get into the experiences, talk about the nitty gritty, but we do have to have like a foundation, like some sort of basis for understanding. so that we can all be on the same page. So there's this beautiful thing called culturally relevant pedagogy. And it says, a form of teaching that calls for engaging learners whose experiences and cultures are traditionally excluded from mainstream settings. Okay? Now, these are the goals in culturally relevant pedagogy. First, teaching must yield academic success. Yeah, no doubt. No one wants to do anything more, right? So priorities do not change because there's a discrepancy in cultural understanding. There's a possibility here to further heighten our intellectual world by simply challenging our rigid notions of forms of learning. So if you get what I'm saying, it's like, if you're a Latinx student and you're a teacher that doesn't relate to that culture, it doesn't mean that your priorities change. It just means that the way in which you teach have to change. And in that change, there's this beautiful process of mutual learning and understanding that I feel is necessary and vital, right? So our goals don't change. Second, teaching must help students develop positive ethnic and cultural identities while simultaneously helping them achieve academically. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if I'm teaching history and I constantly talk about George Washington and everybody in the classroom is either Black or brown, there's gonna be a discrepancy of information in terms of how relatable the information you're providing as a teacher is gonna hit me. If you talk about how, Native Americans of the past, Native Americans in their day, or, back in history when Native Americans were alive, then you're obviously excluding people. And so then it doesn't become a positive outlook on like a cultural and ethnicity, right? So that's what that's talking about. Third, teaching must support students' ability to recognize, understand, and critique current and social inequities. That right there is vital. The way I understand it and the way peer practitioners understand that is simple. We cannot hide our students from the realities of the world. When we talk about safe spaces in the classroom, a safe space doesn't mean that you deny them information. It means that you walk them through the information, and that means all information that is relevant to their lives. It doesn't just mean information in classroom as a subject, which we'll talk about later. Even the term subject is a problem. But it means that we try to understand the students holistically, and we try to help them navigate through that information in very complex world. Okay, so one thing that I wanted to bring back up is Miss Perry. Miss Perry understood the simple fact, and that is a fact that's supported by is a Harvard Symposium on Education and Mental Health. Okay, if this is what the quote says: if you don't belong somewhere, that's not where you're going to look for help. So trust and belonging are key for students' mental health and education. So if the goal is to get students to learn, then give them the space to learn in a way that makes sense to them. Ms. Perry saw me, and she saw my interest, and she nurtured my interest. So my interest correlated with her course objectives, luckily and happily probably for her, because I wanted to read and I wanted to write. I just didn't want to read and write the information she was giving me. And so she allowed me to blossom as a practitioner of the topic, right? In this case, being English. I, as a student, didn't understand Ms. Perry's objectives necessarily. Like, I didn't know what objectives she had as a teacher or what requirements she needed to fulfill as a student. But she understood mine. And all I needed from that was understanding from her to allow me to respect her as a teacher. So now, beyond turning in your work, or for a student to turn in the work, my question to you is, what is the purpose of you being a teacher? What is your purpose as a teacher? What inspired you to be a teacher? I'm sure if you're here, it's because you want to make some sort of a difference, and you believe teaching the future is one of the ways in which we can do that. So if you believe that, now we have to sort out how we have to do that. And if the world is changing, then we have to change with the world. Some of us will say the world hasn't changed. The world is the same. It's just now we're seeing things that we didn't see before. Okay. Miss Perry succeeded in that with me. And so this is where I learned this idea of like cultural pedagogy from a real life experience. That's what that looks like. right? We can hear and understand theory and read it and learn all about it, but how it manifests is the most important thing. And so I hope by talking about Miss Perry and her experience with me, or my experience with her, it can kind of help you understand what that actually looks like, these big words like cultural relevant pedagogy. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to talk about the Latinx community. That's what I focus on. Those are the things that I, the community that I work with and the community that I'm a part of. So for those of you who are working with the Latinx community, raise your hand. I'm going to assume that I can see all the hands. And I'm sure, in one way or another, there's a discrepancy in terms of culture, especially with the Latinx community. So here's a little insight into our community. Number one, there is this concept called the newcomer. It's a concept, I call it a complex. Latinx communities have a newcomer complex. What does that mean? Well, to begin, the narrative becomes about us wanting, desiring, and demanding that we become accepted by those who control that of which we want to be a part of. We are never in a position of power because we accept that if we are newcomers to this form of education, religion, jobs, and overall social norms and customs, then we have nothing to teach but everything to learn. We're always the ones who are taught and never the ones who are teaching. And when we teach, by nature of this complexity or this complex notion of newcomer, we're teaching from the perspective that the knowledge that we're teaching is not our own. So then ultimately we accept the principle that we are inferior because we know less. Okay. The Latinx community grows up thinking that we're not from here, meaning from the US, and we're not from there, from our family's country of origin. And so we're in this kind of, we call it liminal space or third space, where we don't feel like we belong, particularly in the world that we're participating in when we step out of our home, like a school. And then we don't feel like we fully belong in our home because we don't have the same upbringing as our parents or great-grandparents or what have you. And so we're always on this concept of like, ni de aquí, ni de allá. We're not from here, we're not from there. So imagine your student walking into your classroom, having that in their head. Do you think that your student is gonna ask you for additional support? That if they see something is wrong, that they're gonna speak up about it? Oftentimes you'll notice that Latinx students tend to be a little bit more quiet than, say, for example, like English first speakers, like Black folks or white folks especially. We're not quiet people. We're rowdy, we make a lot of noise, and we like to party. On every weekend, if you live around the Latinx community, we like to party. But for whatever reason, or assuming that we don't know what we just talked about right now, why is it that students are so quiet? Well, this is one of the main reasons. Okay, let's keep it moving. So what students are thinking about today, youngsters, especially the ones that I work with in college, they're saying, we're not gonna keep it 100, we're gonna keep it 200. And what does that mean? Well, if you live in a bicultural world in the way that we do, and a bilingual world in the way that we do, it almost tells you that you gotta split your identity, 50% here and 50% there. And so then if you do that, you complete a 100, but you're never 100 of either of the two. You're just half of one and half of the other. So then what students are saying now is like, well, we can keep it 100 here and keep it 100 there. So we don't look at our culture as a deficit, like we have to take things away, but we look at it as an asset. We bring everything that comes with our cultures. And so then we keep it 200. All right. Ultimately, this is the idea. If we built it, we should be in it. If we grow it, we should be able to eat it. If we create it, we should be able to use it. Those are empowering words that come from students. Think of farm workers, think of the meat packaging industry and on the East Coast. Think of construction in the Midwest. A lot of those jobs are being taken up by the Latinx community, but our parents feel like, well, we can't afford the house that we're helping build. We can't afford the food that we're helping package. you know, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, moving on to this other thing called culturally responsive teaching. Okay. Let's begin by acknowledging the picture on the right and all of her beauty, Nina Simone. If you don't know who Nina Simone is, please Google her, understand her language, understand her life, her music, so that you can always have beauty in your life. Okay. Now, she has this beautiful quote. It's not the one on the left, but her quote says, "Artists must reflect the times that they live in." And when I hear that, all I have to do is replace the word artist with educators or education or construction workers. And in addition to that, we take that understanding, and when it's implemented in our classrooms, what I've noticed for my students in college especially is that we're not learning subjects. We learn information that will help us engage in living and breathing communities. If you go back to the very first topic, it was never about becoming a better educator, but becoming a better community member. And so then when you approach school, not from a perspective of I'm going to teach a specific subject, but rather I'm going to help my student better understand another part of the world that is going to be relevant to their life post-education, that's what we want. That's the type of education mentality that we want to have. Okay. Culturally relevant teaching is this: to use the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, frames of reference, and performance styles of ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more relevant to and effective for them. If you don't know Dr. Javina, you should. She's amazing. She wrote a book around 2000 called Culturally Responsive Teaching, Theory, Practice, and Research. And she's got a ton of other books. She's amazing. Okay. So this is what we want to get out of this information, right? We want to be able to create campus safe spaces for students to meet and talk about their struggles. So ask yourself the question, if students have issues at school or in your classroom, do they have a safe space that they can go to try to figure out and address those issues? Some of you might say, well, classroom is that. But what if the student doesn't feel all that comfortable talking with you about their personal issues? Well, that's why they have counselors. Well, and if they have issues with their teachers, more likely they're going to have issues with their counselors if there's an issue of communication, right? Because they'll see the teacher more, and if they can't speak to the teacher, they're less likely to speak to a counselor. They're more likely to talk to their fellow students. Okay. Now, with that, position resources where students and families feel comfortable accessing them, right? So, in other words, connect better with the families and friends to whom students might initially turn when they're having trouble. So again, think of your student in a holistic way. Like, who is the student's community as a student, period? You're one part of their community. But like all of us, right? Like, think of your family. You're going to go talk to your moms about something. You'll talk to your brother about something else. Many times you'll speak to people in very specific topics because you know who they are, you know the responses that they have. Well, what makes us think that teachers have the solutions for everything the student needs? Why not the teacher better understand the world of the student to the best of your ability so that you can better address your issues? Sometimes better addressing the issues doesn't mean that you have to be the one spending the time, but it could be just simply providing a space with people that they feel comfortable with. Okay, so with all of that, right, especially as Latinx students, our history experiences should travel to our future. If you find yourself telling a Latinx student that, or making them feel like part of their story, part of the life, part of their experiences, their family members not being able to speak Spanish or English is somehow a barrier to their understanding the future, then it's wrong, period. There's no other way about it. If you welcome in all of these different topics that I just mentioned, you will allow the student to feel more like they belong. And when students feel like they belong, like in my case with Ms. Perry, I will provide you with the necessary work that needs to get done, and I will do it with a good attitude. Lastly, John Wilson says, hold the crown over your student's head, not a question mark. Okay, and that is it. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much, Olmeca. It was really great to read the comments. Thank you all for participating the way you did. To summarize, a lot of the comments were, a lot of the teachers either identified with you as a student while they were going through school, or they identified as a teacher having students who had similar struggles, similar interests as you did. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of combining a lot of the comments and the questions that were posed. If you have another question you would like me to ask Olmeca, please put in the chat box or in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to get to all the questions. The first question is, are these slides, is this recording going to be available? And I believe at the end of the summit, the academy, I'm sorry, that you'll get access to the slides, all the presenter slides, and that you can watch this video again on the Facebook Live. And then I believe it'll be available on the national board. We'll get you more information about that later. So the first question, Olmeca, was how do you integrate this when teachers are required to teach a prescribed curriculum and a prescribed pacing? What suggestions do you have for those teachers?
Yeah, so that's usually what the biggest issue is how do I find a time to better understand my student outside of the classroom, or understanding their nucleus and their community. And the second one is how do I implement any of this if I have a very set curriculum? And the truth is that it's a burden on the teacher that shouldn't be a burden on the teacher. I do believe that administration needs to find space for teachers to have a safe space to vocalize the needs of the students. So in the way that you're creating a space for the students, I feel administration needs to create a space for you for that. Having said that, oftentimes when you can't, or when administration ain't listening, you have to do at least a little bit of research to try to better understand your students and try to figure out what it is that students are into right now. So like, I can tell you what Latinx students in high school are into right now, right? But it's your job to find that in your particular community and just become relevant to them. Like, just speak their language and try to understand their language. You're not gonna be a poser. They're not gonna feel like you're trying too hard or nothing like that, or they might feel like you're trying too hard, but believe me, they're gonna respect it. Okay, so one of the ways of doing that is understanding, for example, like, who is Selena? What is a churro? What's the difference between some, like, the popular music that Latinx students listen to versus what, let's say, white kids listen to? Just trying to understand those things is really fundamental, and it seems really simplistic, but it goes a long way to better understanding your students. Sometimes when you can't change the curriculum, but students understand that you're in it just like they are and trying to help them with something, they're gonna do the work, even if it's not culturally relevant information. They're gonna say, you know what, my teacher I know cares about me because she's going the extra mile to try to better understand me. I'm not gonna be a jerk. I'm gonna try to do what I need to do in the classroom and not give her a hard time. That's oftentimes what students end up doing. Whenever you could sneak in an article, a music video into your curriculum, man, do so, and it'll go a long way.
Thank you. And I think that you're encapsulating a lot of what National Board tries to uphold, which is our core Prop 1, is that teachers know their students. And this means on a personal, but also on an academic level. And so I think that there's a lot of parallels between what you're saying and what National Board tries to embody in their reflective practice. So I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm just going to drop this here, and then we can pick it up later if you're interested. A lot of people in the chat box and the questions have been asking if you're willing to do a little bit of a song. So maybe we might end with that because I did mention that you're a hip hop artist. So, but we'll pick that up when you're ready. But I'm combining the questions and the comments about the idea of a newcomer. I think that this really was something that echoed a lot in a lot of people. So there's a little bit of a spectrum between not stereotyping all of Latinos and the Latinx experience, because there's a lot of diversity, but within the different generations, first generation, second generation, third generation, there's some folks that are saying, you know, do you feel that second and third generation folks still hold on to this newcomer idea, still feel like maybe they don't belong? Or do you feel like it's more on the other side, that the longer you're in the country, the more you can, you feel like you can speak up? And then also, can you talk a little bit about how we can break up the stereotypes within the Latinx community?
Okay, so to the first question, second, third, and beyond generation Latinx people tend to be more vocal, and there's implications as to why. They feel more comfortable. They feel like they belong more. They feel like they're more American, let's say, for example, than a first generation. And in there lies another problem, which is second generation and beyond oftentimes overextend their desire to want to be part of the American mainstream, so to as not be as connected with first generation or migrant families. And so there's a class-based issue there. Oftentimes there's a colorism issue there as well, because a lot of migrants after 1994, a lot of migrants were indigenous and came from the southern parts of Mexico and other parts of Latin America, meaning that they're more indigenous people. So yeah, so there's a discrepancy within the Latinx community because of that. But as an educator, when you're looking at your group of students and there's Latinx students, yeah, you'll notice that students who are second, third generation, they're gonna be more vocal. They're gonna sometimes know less Spanish. They're gonna sometimes even contradict things that like first generation or like migrant students actually say. They might even make fun of those students because, again, they want to distance themselves. To the second question about how do you break stereotypes, I'm curious to know, though, before I answer, is what specifically, what are we talking about? What type of stereotypes? Or
I think the person was referring to when we speak about the Latinx community and experience, we have to understand that there's like you were just talking about, classism, colorism, different access to different things that just make a life more accessible here in the United States, but just always understanding that the Latinx community is large.
Right, okay. So, all right, so speaking from a first generation or like a migrant student, okay? This is what they're dealing with. They're dealing with students of color, including Latinx students, who see them as different, even though many of them are the same. And then at home, they got families who are saying, learn English, learn their culture, learn that culture. In other words, not your culture, learn another culture. And so then that's kind of what they're dealing with. As far as the stereotypes, though, as an educator, one of the main things that we have to do is not segment social issues based on identity. And what I mean by that is this: when you think immigration, you think Latinx. When you think police brutality, you think the Black community. When you think environmental justice, you think white folks and Native Americans, as if those things don't intersect. Now, take that same concept and apply it to everyday living. Certain things that are part of the culture that we live in today, let's call it the American culture, don't pertain to any particular group of people. And so then when you see Latinx students doing something that is different from their culture, it should be celebrated, but also make sure, this is kind of what you got to look for, make sure that what they're doing is not replacing one for the other. Every time they do that, you're looking at a student that doesn't feel good enough, or they don't feel like they belong. And then that's the student that you get when you're trying to teach them math. It's a student that doesn't feel like they know enough. So your job as a educator in terms of breaking stereotypes is to celebrate everything that your student wants to learn, period, without having to replace something else. So if they're learning something that's outside of your classroom, celebrate it. Don't have them, spend time on that when it's not part of the work, but celebrate it. Don't put them on the spot. Don't make them feel like they're doing something wrong. Yes, that's a beautiful thing that you're trying to learn how to rap, but right now we want to learn math. Do you know how math correlates with, you know, rap? Then now it's your job, if you care about that student, to try to figure that out, which it does, but that's kind of how you do that work.
Thank you. There was a lot of, you did, there's a lot of rich dialogue happening in the chat box, and we're talking about how, yes, the Latinx diaspora is large, and it's very specific to your community, the community you teach. So for example, the community I teach has, the majority of our Latinx students are from Mexico, Central America. We also have a pretty large Cuban population. In the last couple of years, our population of Hondureño, Guatemalteco, Salvadoreño population grew. And even as a Latinx person myself, I had to spend the time and spend the energy into understanding the different cultures that I was working with, but understanding that there is a lot of unifying factors between Latinx people. Another question that we can support you answering, because I know it's not necessarily your forte, but we do have a lot of teachers who are elementary school teachers working with young students. And they want to know, you know, how do we create safe campuses for those students? How do we improve our resources that we bring to young students? And what overall resources, suggestions, considerations do you have for those working with young people, very young people, thinking ages 5 to about 12?
Cool. I run away from those. No. One thing I do want to mention is, when you work with the Latinx community, do your due diligence and understanding the particular communities that you're working with. There isn't an umbrella culture called Latinx that fits everybody. And actually, Latinx communities get offended by that. You'll have a lot of Central Americans that have like resentment towards Mexicans because then they get called Mexicans. And rightfully so, they should be upset because they have their own particular culture to share. So you want to make sure that you do that. As far as the second question, honestly, I know that there's a lot of restrictions with K through 12, especially, you know, K through elementary. And it's really hard because I know part of the work is about, it's tough for me to say, but because Juliana is an elementary school teacher, but a lot of it is disciplinary based teaching, you know, and so it becomes very difficult. But I feel like, you know, folks like Tanya, Juliana could probably best answer that question.
Okay, not to take too much of your spotlight, I think that the best way to do that is to always make sure that we engage families, that we see our students as part of their families, part of their communities. And whenever we're teaching our students, we're upholding and valuing their families and their communities. And that we're creating spaces on campus for families to come on and really share their assets, their cultural wealth, but also just their presence, making sure that they're always feeling welcomed and valued. So I'll move on to the next question. There's a lot of themes about belonging and balancing, you know, what some people might call assimilation, some people might call whitewashing, some people might call just surviving. Can you talk a little bit about the notion of how to maintain our culture, maintain your individual culture, your family's culture, but also doing it within the context of school? A lot of teachers have mentioned that, you know, potentially some of their students who are Latinx might be quiet because it's a sign of respect to the teacher, or they might want to blend in. Can you extend on that?
Yeah, and that's actually the core, that's at the core of our understanding here, like this kind of idea of like cultural competency and pedagogy and culturally relevant teaching. That's at the core of it. Beginning with this, the term assimilation is now problematic for people of color, and I'll tell you why. Because when you say assimilation, it means that the Black community and the brown community is assimilating to a culture that they don't belong in, or they don't partake in, or that they didn't help construct. And that's a problem. So assimilation into American culture never means or has never meant white culture only. Black excellence, brown excellence has helped create an economy, an educational form and process that we all now participate in. So there is no assimilation process when we start going from, let's say, a Spanish-speaking community. Say I was born and raised in Los Angeles as a first generation, right? Like me. If I go into school and now I'm learning how to be more vocal, whereas in my family I was more quiet, it doesn't mean I'm learning somebody else's culture. I'm learning the culture that I'm supposed to be growing up in because I'm from here. And so then so we have to move away from that. So then don't think of your students as like, oh my God, I got this student doesn't understand the way the world works here, and now I have to teach them this other thing. Help them understand that is part of who they are. But understanding that, let's call it American culture, is also theirs, because Black America helped build the economy. Latinx people are helping today build the economy, and therefore we belong, we partake in. Like I said in the earlier slides, if we built it, we should be in it. You know what I'm saying? That's the attitude that you gotta have, and that's the type of belonging you wanna give your student. On the flip side of things, right? Then you have like this mutual understanding of learning. So then now it's about the teacher trying to help the student by understanding that particular beauty and asset of being quiet because they want to be respectful to the teacher. So rather than the teacher saying like, hey, you gotta speak up, you gotta say the things that you need to say, because if you don't speak for yourself, then who's gonna speak for you? Well, a Latinx community member is gonna be like, my family, bro. Or like my brothers or my sisters. In other words, we come with our community. And so sometimes in our community, we're not the ones that's going to be vocal. It's going to be somebody else. So in that regard, you have to try to understand that those things are not deficits. Being quiet in class is not a deficit. It's an asset. It's your job now to understand how that isn't actually an asset. In the process, you can help the student understand. So again, it's a mutual responsive knowledge experience. One does not replace the other. One is not wrong and the other one is right. It's about understanding, correlating the two, and ultimately having the students' mental health in a healthy way, so that they can then approach life in the way that they want to. So if they actually do want to become more vocal, it's because now they have a space to do so whenever they can, not because they feel that they have to, because it's a different culture. It's a very different approach.
Some of the other questions that are coming in, how would you integrate this into content areas that aren't English language based? So your maths, your sciences, what recommendations do you have for teachers in those classrooms?
I begin with mathematics is a beautiful thing, because one of the first things, look, Latinx students today, especially elementary kids, they're not going to know who the Aztecs are or who the Tarahumara are, or, you know what I'm saying, like different indigenous communities from Latin America. But this is your opportunity to educate yourself about it, and then and as a result, educate your students about it. Why is that important? Well, because our ancestors and in our indigenous communities today in Latin America, math is vital for us. How do we know that it's vital for us? We studied the stars. We built temples and pyramids. We built water canals. All of that took architecture, and architecture needs math. And so what beautiful thing to know that the students that you're serving come with that rich culture and understanding. It's just that you may not understand that that's where it comes from. So there it is. Now you know. Now do your research and try to bring that to your students. And why is it important? Because you can start your class like that. Like, look at this beautiful pyramid from Mexico City, or Machu Picchu, in Peru. Do y'all think this is beautiful? Yes. Look at the Mount Everest. You think this is beautiful? Yes. Okay, cool. Well, this one right here was constructed by human beings that are like you, that look like you, that speak like you. And you'll see, I see that with young students, where they go like, oh, it's because it almost becomes like like a superhero type of attitude where it's like, whoa, you know, I built that right there. That's, again, like a sense of belonging, like a sense of like, I have the capacity to learn something that's already in my culture is very different than approaching it from like, oh, you're about to learn something new that you've never seen before.
Thank you. I'm thinking back to when I learned about the zero and how the zero originated in Mayan culture. And I think about the amazing architecture that was tied to astrology and that kind of stuff. Even though I'm Colombiana, I'm not Mexican, but I have a great appreciation for our original ancestors, you know, and believing that this continent is one, and there was always a lot of fluidity among the people on this continent. I think that that's one of the things I'm seeing some chat about students, Latinx students at schools maybe not getting along if they're from different countries. Can you speak a little bit about that, about how we can embrace and support our students in transnationally building with students here in the US?
Yeah, like I was saying, right? The you know, look, there's around 58 or 59, the numbers keep changing, right? 50 million Latinx identified people in the US, 64 to 65% of those are Mexican. So you have a hegemonic culture within a culture, which means that for the rest of the world outside of the Latinx culture, everything might seem Mexican. And so although they don't mean to offend, they're actually offending all the multiplicity of other cultures and national identities, right? Salvadoreño, Guatemalteco. When we speak of the Mayans, we think Mexico, but the Mayans are also in Guatemala. They're also in many parts of Central America, right? So I feel like one of the things that can get done is like, for example, Caribbean cultures are not that well connected with Central American and Mexican cultures. It's almost divided demographically. Like in the East Coast, you have a lot of Caribbean-based, Puerto Riqueño, Cubano, from La Costa, like folks from Colombia on that side. And then on the West Coast, you have people from Central America and you have people from Mexico, a lot. So I think that when you find those two cultures together, you might want to approach it from the perspective of like, hey, let's teach each other about each other's culture. You know, food is always a good way to bring communities together, because you not only bring you not only bring students, but you have the opportunity to involve the families. You know, how beautiful would it be to tell a Colombian family, hey, you know, bring a beautiful national dish that you want to share with everybody. And then you do the same with the other cultures that exist in your class. And you do it from the perspective not of, we're going to do a cultural enrichment session, you know, which is very kind of trivial, but this is really like hard work that you're doing to try to better engage your students. And that's how I feel that work needs to be approached. Like, yo, I need to do this because I want to understand the differences and the nuances so that when my students argue, I could chime in, I can facilitate a conversation. Accents are a big issue as well. Like, you know, if you hear somebody speaking like with the Puerto Rican accent and you hear like a Guatemalteco accent, they're very different. Sometimes they don't understand each other. So I think that's very vital to bring the cultures together by sharing the culture with the understanding that they both come from Latin America, which is a shared history of oppression, but also of resistance. And there's things there that tie us together.
Absolutely. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to answer everyone's question. I've done my best to tie things together. We're going to do just a few more things before we log off. We have about 7 minutes. So I'm going to ask one more question about language. But before I do that, people want to know how to reach you, Olmeca. What's the best way to reach you if they have further questions or they want to continue to engage?
Raise your hand if you're on Instagram. Instagram is probably the fastest way that you can get a hold of me, and I'll put it here, but I also put my email. Wait,
wonderful.
I can add it here, right, to everybody? Yeah,
you can just put it in the chat. Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
And the information is also on the slides, so when everybody gets the slides at the end of the academy. So then I was wondering if you might answer the question on Mecca, and then you might leave us with a little verse so everyone
Okay.
can get a taste of your music. And then after that, we'll close out and give everybody a chance to fill out the survey so that we can improve our sessions. So the question, understanding and respecting that this is a very big topic, but the question is about first generation Latinx students in language, and also second and third generation. So we had folks who were chiming in saying, you know, I'm second or third generation. My parents didn't want me to speak Spanish because they were afraid of, you know, discrimination, limited opportunities, etc. And now I'm having a struggling learning Spanish. What can I do? To our students and maintaining their languages and having a disconnect between their own families, being able to communicate in the same language with their own families. Can you talk a little bit about language in our community, and then leave us with a song?
Yes, I'll do my best. Okay, language. Teach your students everything, because all information is valuable. And teach families everything because all information is valuable. How can we get families to understand that maintaining their culture is just as important as their students learning in English? That's kind of like the question one. Second question is, how do we get students to understand that their family culture that they grew up with is just as valuable as living as an American in the United States? Okay. As a student, as a teacher, as a practitioner of social justice, and as an activist, I feel like the world is going to be much better when we do that. So what I do with my students, and even when I was doing like workshops with, you know, high school students, I never told, it goes back to the same thing. I never told them that anything that they have to bring is invaluable, it's not valuable, but rather that is valuable. But where it's gonna matter the most, honestly, is your engagement with the families. That's gonna be the most important thing there, because students listen to their family members. And if the family members know and they don't feel like they're gonna be attacked by the police, or that the teacher is gonna send the cops on them for speaking Spanish, then you're gonna see the power in the families. Because what you wanna get out of all of this is you wanna empower the student, and the student can help empower the families. Because what we want is an empowering community. That's what we want when you teach. You don't want a student that just learns mathematics that goes and gets a good job, because what they do is they end up leaving everybody else behind. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to create that world anymore. We want to create a world that we bring people with us. And so you got to find a way to empower the families. And the way that you do, one of the ways in which you do that, is you acknowledge them and the knowledge that they have and the wisdom that they have to share. That's the best way that I can, you know, help understand that part. And that involves language, and it involves many other things. Okay. Look at that. I will forever be 200 Nigerian American. Keep it 200. That's what I'm saying. All right. So, So I leave you with this. It's called Pieces of Me. And it goes. Now, if you're listening, I want you to, like, don't snap your fingers. I won't hear it, but, you know, do it at home. Stomp your feet, clap your hands, something to help us acknowledge that we share experience. Okay. It goes. I didn't come from a broken home. Instead, just the opposite. A loving family with problems, though, a victim of my surroundings. Our biggest obstacle was lack of education and poverty, forced to do what was needed for a bit of food insecurity. It's hard to see the warmth of my family's love turned into a cold hug because the money problem's unresolved. 2 jobs ain't enough. Still, they grind harder than most. I'm pissed off at the world because we're now given no choice. But how did we get here? Our folks forced out of their country. You must be crazy. No one crosses the desert because they want to. It's a necessity, a sacrifice for the family. So you don't call them illegals, you call them economic refugees. In this part of the song, I would tell you, imagine how you felt. But I know you don't need to imagine, because if you've been poor, then you know the feeling real to you and vivid, because you felt it, tasted, smelt it. In other words, you've also lived it. I turned my head away from anger because it would have been easy to pick up the pistol and bang on the ones I thought were responsible. Instead, I dreamt in Spanish and stared at my hands. I saw the color of my skin, reminding me the days my grandpa said, "Mijo, la cultura cura y la sangre indígena es pura." I stopped talking and suddenly I heard the whispers in the city. "I share your pain," they said. "We also want to be free." So instead of throwing up signs or throwing rocks at buildings, I threw my fist in the air and joined the rest of the children. I could not turn the other cheek because it's easy to forget, but it is hardest to regret. See, I'm not a gangster, I don't bang. I'm not a hustler, I don't slang. But a ghetto kid, that's the reason for my swagger and my slang. I'm not dying for the block, see, I don't own nothing there. But for my people, I'll give my life and work until we win the fight. Hey.